and thanks for joining us for this KOMO News special Town Hall, Trump 2.0, the Washington Impact. I'm Chris Daniels. The election results are in. Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States after winning the popular vote in a red shift.
I think, the best person for the job won, fair and square.
Even Washington State, where Trump again garnered less than 40% of the vote, had a fractional move to the right.
The elected President Trump had a message that resonated in a lot of the swing states.
The dynamics prompted Washington's governor-elect Bob Ferguson to take a measured approach in his first comments.
So I want to be clear, and this is really important, the president has a lot of power. That's the way our system works.
Ferguson says he's not looking for confrontation and knows the state is reliant on federal funding for multiple programs, which is all context for how leaders approach certain hot-button issues.
I wouldn't be surprised if things changed radically, but I hope they don't.
And that is why KOMO News has gathered together policymakers, key civic leaders, and analysts to discuss what the vote totals may mean for the future of Washington State. Over the course of this KOMO News Town Hall, we will talk more about the numbers with 3 University of Washington political scientists. You will also hear from the Democrat who defied the odds, Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, who won re-election in her 3rd district, a Republican-leaning district. And we will talk about the key issues for Washingtonians that could be dramatically impacted by this new administration: trade, homelessness, and immigration. But first, let's talk to those political scientists who have looked at these numbers: James Long, Victor Minaldo, and Scott Lemieux. Victor, Scott, James, thank you for doing this. You've been watching the numbers as they have come in. You have seen what is now being reported on a national and a local state level. I guess open-ended question to start. What do you think about what the numbers show, the voter turnout shows, both on a national level and on a local level? And James, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, nationally, we know the turnout, it appears this year was not as high as it was in 2020, particularly on the side of Democratic voters. And so I think that definitely hurt Kamala Harris's campaign. We also do see the turnout was down slightly in state of Washington. Washington usually has really high turnout. I think mail-in voting helps with that. But, above 80% is typical. And I think the last numbers I saw were around 78 or 79%. So a little bit lower than they've been previously. And I think the last time Washington State was that low, I think, was in 2000.
Yeah, that's my understanding, is that, it looks like turnout will be lower than 2020, but also still pretty high for a presidential election. So still higher than 2016 or 2012. So, some of the sort of increase in turnout, has the trend has dropped off a little bit, but not all the way down to where we were sort of towards the beginning of the 21st century. But definitely a big story that continues to go on here is that despite some of Donald Trump's flaws as a candidate, he does seem to have a real ability to mobilize sporadic and new voters. In 2020, that was kind of offset by his ability to mobilize Democratic voters, but this time it worked much more in his favor. There is a potential downside for Republicans there, which is that while we're used to high turnout elections favoring Democrats, given the changes in the coalitions, it's now the obvious. It's sort of the most reliable voters, the voters who show up for off-term elections and special elections, tend to be more now on the Democratic side, which does pose some problems, especially if Republicans have a really slim House majority, that will produce some potential problems for them down the road. But obviously, in terms of the 2024 results, was I think a key reason that Trump won was that they were able to maintain their 2020 voters a little better than Kamala Harris and the Democrats were.
One of the storylines that's already developed on a national level is the fact that voters of color voted more than they did in 2020 for Donald Trump. And there's an interesting story just in Seattle. Danny Westing in the Seattle Times has covered this, the idea that the Chinatown International District moved in a big way, voters there towards Donald Trump, and some of the areas that might have been more of a shade of red in Seattle actually became bluer. Some of the wealthier neighborhoods in Seattle voted more for Democrats in this election than they have previously. How do we explain this on a local level? Those changes that seem to be a microcosm of what we've seen on a national level.
I'd be interested to hear from Victor and Scott first.
I think that the results from Chinatown are interesting, and I do think, and again, I think that this was a very difficult election for Democrats structurally. Incumbent parties were facing a lot of headwinds, and I think Harris ran a decent campaign, all things considering. But there really are some failures of governance in blue states and blue cities that I think we have to take seriously. I think one of these is housing costs we may return to, but you can see, it's probably not surprising that the parts of Seattle that are relatively safe continue to trend blue, whereas in Chinatown, where there really are, and all the sort of great restaurants used to be open till 2 a.m. are now closed at 8 or closed at all. Where there really is an enormous amount of open air drug dealing, and we just had the recent stabbings, and I do think that's something we should take seriously. And I think things are trending a bit in the right direction. I think that there's been a more serious effort to have security on the light rail. And that doesn't have to mean like armed people with guns, but I think that public services should be usable, and people should expect to have safe neighborhoods. And it's not terribly surprising that in neighborhoods where I think the city is neglecting those responsibilities, that there's a bit of a red shift. So I do think that's a bit of a signal that while I think we obviously continue to need to take sort of abuses of police power seriously, we also have to take the fact that people want safe neighborhoods, and that's especially true of relatively less affluent neighborhoods where these things are more felt. So I don't know if that's an entire explanation, but that would certainly be one thing that would come to mind to the extent that the idea is trending a little red.
Yeah, Victor, what do you think?
Yeah, those are well articulated points. I would add to that, I suppose, that folks from minority groups might also be folks that are working in middle class, like there's a correlation there. And they were exposed to a greater degree to issues that were extremely salient and that benefited President-elect Trump. And that would be something like inflation. It's harder to hedge against inflation when you are working class or middle class. The second thing would be, as Scott said, public safety. You might live in a neighborhood that is more vulnerable when it comes to not only shoplifting, but also violent crime. You might yourself be the owner of a small shop where vandalism or shoplifting affects you. And then the other is, and maybe ironically, unauthorized border crossings and immigration. Folks that are coming from Venezuela or Central America or even the Middle East, where are they going to go? They're probably going to go to neighborhoods where there are more settled populations of voters who are in minority groups, and whatever problems that are associated with that swell will impact folks on the ground, not folks that live in Magnolia or something like that. So those are the three one-off factors. But there is an alternative hypothesis, and that's about the Democratic coalition fraying. And that would be a story that runs along the lines of individuals in so-called minority groups don't see themselves as minorities. They see themselves as individuals, and identity politics is just not working anymore. And so therefore you need to adjust your pitch and maybe the Democrats' strategy going forward is to speak to folks less about their group solidarity and more about their individual experiences, needs, and aspirations.
James, anything to add?
No, my hypothesis, I think, was Scott's, which is the public safety issue, is the thing that came first to mind. I live in Central District, so not very far from the ID. And, I was sort of wondering that about the CD as well, about whether or not there might be a shift, although I think things have improved in the last few months. But I think public safety is a huge issue for Asian Americans, particularly in big cities like San Francisco, LA, and Seattle.
Yeah, and to your point, we have seen a trend politically on the West Coast in major cities, whether it be Portland or San Francisco or Los Angeles. Politically, it is not too far-fetched hear about the changing electorate in the Chinatown International District, just given the same issues have existed in those other cities. So here we are talking about the executive branch and Congress, both chambers of Congress being controlled by one party, the Supreme Court appearing to lean conservative. Is there any sort of historical comparison here for the amount of control that we are potentially going to see from one side of the aisle in Washington, D.C., and what that may mean?
I mean, there's one way in which, that it's pretty typical in American history, actually, for there to be one dominant party. So certainly, at the height of the New Deal era, Democrats had large majorities, and after 1937 control of the Supreme Court, same thing in the Gilded Age in the 20s, was an era of Republican dominance in which, Republicans and conservative Democrats dominated the Supreme Court. So on one way, it's not that unusual, but there are a couple things that are a little unusual about this moment. First of all, our parties are a lot more, a lot less heterogeneous than they used to be. So it's true that there were large Democratic majorities in the mid-50s, but often Congress was really controlled by a coalition of Southern Democrats and Republicans. It's sort of way so that the large majorities were not necessarily always effective governing majorities, depending on the circumstances. Now we don't have parties where there are a lot of liberal Republicans and there are fewer conservative Democrats. So that means that that even smaller majorities might in some ways be able to accomplish more. The second thing is that that when parties were dominant, they were generally winning by large amounts of the popular vote in a typical election. This is a period of really close party competition. That while Trump's victory in the Electoral College was very decisive, he's actually probably going to win the popular vote by less than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. So I think one thing that's a little bit jarring is that you have, relatively small shifts in voting, producing these huge policy yo-yos. And that's relatively unusual in American history.
Democrats were pitching this as saving democracy, and clearly the voters felt like, in terms of democracy, this was the way they wanted to go, and there's a lot of unknown here about what it's going to mean in 2025 and beyond. What do you make of the fact that was a pitch that did not resonate in most states around the country? You just look at the voting trends and the way people shifted in most states. Even states that were that are considered blue states shifted a bit to the right. What do you make of the idea that was a pitch that really didn't seem to resonate?
Well, I'm not sure that I think it didn't resonate as much as I don't think it resonated in the way that originally the Biden campaign and then the Harris campaign wanted it to resonate. So protecting democracy, I think, was the plurality winner on nationwide exit polls in terms of the most important issue. But I think the way the Harris campaign thought about that issue and how they were defining threats to democracy is not necessarily the way all voters were thinking about it. I mean, I think there were a lot of voters who thought Harris was the threat to democracy or Joe Biden staying was the threat to democracy. And so I think it's not so much that the idea itself doesn't matter, it's that the definition of what that meant and sort of what the policies around that or how it should attach to the candidate had different meanings, and that's what got muddled. I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I think we would probably all agree that if Harris had had better or stronger or more messaging on the economy, perhaps she would have done better. That's very hard, though, if people are dissatisfied with the incumbent party and you're from the incumbent party. So, I think she was still somewhat constrained. But I think also one of the things that surprises me is that it doesn't seem that the abortion rights issue really resonated with voters in such a way that it caused them to vote for Harris. And so we have a lot of states where there were abortion rights on the ballot. People voted to protect abortion rights, but then they would vote for Donald Trump or they would vote for the Republicans. And so I was very surprised that the issue of abortion didn't resonate as strongly, both in terms of overall turnout, but also in terms of people actually supporting the Harris campaign.
Scott or Victor?
I would say running on protecting democracy is not the best approach. It worked during the midterms when turnout was depressed and more educated people or folks that had higher incomes came out and voted for the Democrats. And if you look at the electorate, most people, like north of 65% of people, don't have college educations. They don't know what the word fascism means. And they're open to being persuaded by counter-positioning by the other party, like James said, that will argue that the biggest threats to democracy are the incumbent party that are like politicizing the prosecution of its political enemies.
And I would say the same thing about abortion. I think one thing, it seems sort of odd to talk about Donald Trump as a moderate figure, but Trump actually has some pretty shrewd political instincts. And one thing he really tried to do was to present himself as a moderate on abortion rights, to oppose a national abortion ban, and to sort of, persuade people that, you live in a blue state, nothing's going to change. Now, if it turns out that they don't do anything with respect to abortion, then that could work. But if you get attempts to interfere with the distribution of mifepristone, if they're further, states continue to ban abortion, again, then that's not going to work as well. And you may see the issue come back at the midterms.
Washington Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp Perez was just elected to her second term in the state's 3rd congressional district in Southwest Washington, defeating Republican Joe Kent, although her district once again favored Donald Trump. I asked her how she thinks she did it and what she thinks it means for the Democrats in the near future. All right, Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. You've got kind of an interesting story in your district, and this has been a Trump-leaning district, 7 points in 2016, 4 points in 2020. He's winning here in 2024, yet you just won re-election. How'd you do it?
Well, I really, I love my community. I listen to people here. When they tell me that 40% of the babies born in my hospital, largest hospital, have at least one parent addicted to fentanyl, I listen to them. I hear them when they say, we need border security. I listen to people who say, we want shop class in junior high. We want to have good jobs that don't require a college degree. And so a relentless focus on the values and priorities of my community, reflecting those and fighting for those here with every fulcrum and lever I can find, that has, I think, created an outcome election where people, are voting for confidence in my system and ability to legislate on our behalf.
When you came out very early this year and said that you didn't believe Joe Biden was going to get reelected, was that something you were hearing from within the district, or was that just a gut reaction?
Oh, yeah. People, I pay attention to what people are talking about, at daycare drop-off or, out at the grocery store. And I was confident that this was not going in the right direction. This was not going to end up in the direction people in DC were saying.
And was that strictly based on the economy and the economic indicators you were seeing in your district? Because there are, from Lewis County to the north and parts to the south. These are counties that have traditionally had higher unemployment rates than, say, King County, Pierce County, Snohomish County. Was that what you were hearing was the top issue in your district?
Oh, I would say the top maybe 8 issues I heard about at the door were all economic. Whether people couldn't afford their drugs, couldn't afford or get buy a home, or just seeing their paycheck not go as far at the grocery store. All of those things were very front of mind for my community.
And you talked about that on the campaign trail, but why do you think other Democrats didn't as much? Because in the postmortem, a lot of people are talking about that was one of the factors here in the presidential race. Why don't you think more Democrats were talking about economic issues on the campaign trail?
I'm not sure. What I've seen in DC is there's a lot of people with spreadsheets that get out in front of you and show you, there's that joke and there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. People can make numbers represent the reality they want to show you. And for me, it's really important to have, to touch grass and talk to people and see what's going on in your community. You have to know what those numbers represent to know whether they're telling the full picture. And so I can't speak for other campaigns. I can just say what worked in my community.
Well, you related a story to the New York Times about being at a party with the vice president and the trees that were in that room. How do you think that relates to what we're talking about here with the issues that matter in your district?
Well, I've said what I want to say about that, but I think the bigger cultural thing is that like a lot of people in DC, like it feels like to me like everybody here is under 40 and has multiple degrees. And that's just a different worldview. That's just a different set of experiences than the ones that are normal where I live. And really being able to hear people and prioritize our farmers, our schools, our roads and bridges. That's the focus. I think that's the point here is that, people think they're saying one thing and everybody is hearing a different thing. And you really need to understand what people hear when you're, putting out messages, whether they're, verbal or not.
A lot of people objectively are looking to your race and what you have done in your district with these other headwinds for people that don't know your background, that live maybe in the I-5 corridor in the biggest three counties. I mean, you started an auto repair shop, and you've talked about the trades and doing more for the trades and people who work in the trades, whether that's in construction or auto repair or otherwise. What can Democrats learn there about just finding candidates like you who have a similar lived experience? Because you hear this criticism on a national level now that Democrats are out of touch and listening to their high-paid consultants.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's everywhere. It's not just a single party problem. Like, I remember when I got elected, they give you a book of like everybody who's been elected in your class. And I was going through the book trying to find somebody who was like, I had something in common with, and somebody listed that they owned a family business. And so I found them and I was like, hey, what's your family business? I'm a small business owner too. And they're like, oh, we have a real estate investment fund, or something like that. It was like not my experience. Like for me, a very formative, radicalization maybe. It was like having an OSHA inspector show up at my shop and ask me if my AC machine was a welder. And this is somebody with the power to shut down my business. And that is a very common experience of people in the trades, of not having the respect from, people with clipboards that we merit.
Yeah, because you look further in Washington State, and there's some people who have come from money that have been able to run campaigns and be successful over the last, say, 20, 25 years as a Democrat. That's why you've got this different background. I mean, have you talked to other people in the trades throughout the state or back in D.C. trying to build some sort of coalition or encourage others to run as Democrats?
I mean, my first State of the Union guest was the high school shop teacher from Kalama High School, who is a genius. I love him so much, Corey Torpa. And we have a lot to say. Like, not everything that is knowable you can learn in a classroom. Some things you have to teach yourself through like hard-earned experience. And that is valuable in the legislative table. You do not get good legislation without people who have actually changed diapers, turned wrenches, driven trucks. Like, you need the full spectrum of the American experience if you want to get legislation that is useful to people. And so I think it's really important that we break this stereotype that the only people who are qualified to legislate are people who can raise $100,000 off of their phone list, their family, who have a law degree, and no kids. Like, I think maybe there are fewer than 5 members of Congress who actually have a child in daycare, and that, like, that really, that's out of 435 members, right? Like, we need a representative body.
When you're in your district and you're talking to these people, there are a fair amount of Trump voters, and it appears that a lot of them still voted for you. What is that? Who are those voters? I mean, that's one of the things that a lot of people are looking at nationwide. All these states that seem to move in the one direction, more red, even in traditionally blue states. And Washington State is a traditionally blue state, but you have a district that has shades of purple, and a lot of people didn't just vote along party lines. Who are those people? Who do you think those people are in your district?
Yeah, there's this story about Southwest Washington that, we tell ourselves like that, the trees were so big here that you could not cut them down by yourself. You had to have somebody come from, usually the men would go out and work together to create farmland, right? And women stayed home and ran the household. So you simultaneously had a culture of independence in women, like running things for long periods of time. And you also had cooperation. And it's the same way today. Like, I'm on a community well. I get my water from a well with 5 other families, and that generator needs to work every winter when the power's out. And so I think there's something about being in the woods and like in a natural resource economy where you have a deeper sense of community that transcends politics. And that is the antidote to what we see, this dysfunction in government and in DC, is having people who understand we have to work together.
And there was one vote in particular that your vote went against some of your colleagues in the Democratic Party. That was the student loan debt relief, and you made a point on this of why you thought that was not a good idea. For our viewers who have not heard your position on this, why do you think that also speaks to your district? Because there are a lot of educated people in Western Washington, people who have taken out large sums of money to get their higher education. Why was that bill in particular, you think, speak to kind of a larger issue?
Yeah, when I looked at the bill, well, I was one of 2 Democrats to vote against that, and I looked at the data and I saw that in the ranking of states who would benefit from this bill as it was proposed, Washington State ranked 48 out of 50 in terms of money coming back. And my district only carries 3% of the federally issued student loan debt in the state. Okay, so this was not a bill that was written with us at the table. There are a lot of ways to have a good family wage job, to own a home and raise a family that don't require a college degree. And the question for me that's bigger is, why has tuition increased 481% since I was born? We need to have accountability and fix the structural issues, not focusing on like Band-Aids or party favors. It's got to be a bigger evaluation. And, for me, I say, like, I believe in progressive tax structure, right? That was not a progressive tax structure. We need to be ideologically consistent when we say what we believe and what we want to do with our federal tax dollars, and make sure they're going to people that can use them to the best effect, and not just who is lobbying for a benefit. Another kind of corollary issue is like when we saw where the electric tax vehicle credits were going. By and large, these were people buying, a third vehicle, and it's like people are making, and I saw every day, like people trying to make their Toyota Corolla from 1997 make it to, over 500,000 miles, right? Like we need to think clearly about where our dollars are going and how we can build the coalition of people who are really benefiting and steering policy.
And I know you have talked about this during the campaign, and you continue to talk about this, that you don't focus on the national issues, that you focus on the local issues in your district. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about how you're going to handle 2025 with an administration that's run by the Republicans and the executive branch and both chambers of Congress, and you can argue the Supreme Court as well. What is it going to be like for you to go in there and try to make change and try to advise your fellow Democrats when the one party is going to have control?
Well, it's not political for me. It is, how do we get this work done? Like, there are very serious issues, fentanyl, jobs, home ownership, housing. There are things that really matter that are not partisan. And I'm not going to take my foot off the gas of trying to make progress and deliver value for my community, regardless of who is in the Oval Office. That's not the point here. The point is that my community has a lot to bring to the table, and we have real needs that need to be elevated and addressed.
Congresswoman, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
Of course, immigration is top of mind for many Washingtonians after Trump campaigned on a platform including threats of mass deportation. I talked at length with Matt Adams of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. Matt, thanks again for joining us for this special. I think the first question, maybe the most wide open. You have seen the results of this election. You have seen what has been said on the campaign trail. What's your initial thought as it pertains to immigration in Washington State?
I just think it's really unfortunate that immigration continues to be, political theater instead of any meaningful efforts to fix problems, figure out where we can move forward. And the Trump campaign, its focal point was really riding on this anti-immigrant agenda. And I think we're going to be in for difficult years for our immigrant community members, but also for the communities in large, because our immigrant communities provide so much to Washington State communities that it's going to have negative impacts, not just on immigrants and their family members, but also on the community at large, the businesses, schools.
Yeah, explain that if you can a little bit, because there is some data to suggest that the immigrant population is a big part of Washington State's economy when it comes to several industries, notably the agricultural industry, notably food service. Where does that come into the conversation here when we talk about this bigger picture of immigration?
We forget about the value of the immigrant communities, and especially here in Washington State. So, there's different numbers, but by and large, it looks like about 70% of the employees in our agricultural industry in Washington State are immigrants. And it doesn't stop there. If you look at the tech community and the math and science positions here within Washington State, you're looking about 30 to 40% of those positions are filled by immigrant workforce. And so they play a huge role, not just in the agriculture industry, but also in the high-tech industry, in the healthcare industry. They're a huge part of that. Again, somewhere around 30% of our industry depends upon, or 30% of the workforce in that industry depends upon immigrant labor. And so, and you can keep on going from there, but all of that kind of gets forgotten about how much we depend upon immigrant labor and the harm that it would cause to our economy if we were to, in fact, eliminate or vastly reduce that workforce.
I think a lot of people look back at what happened in 2017 through 2019, the DACA case in particular, and how many cases were filed here in Washington State. What is your organization doing to prepare for 2025, given everything that was said on the campaign trail?
Yeah, so what we learned from the first time around is that we have to take these threats seriously. A lot of people the first time around said, well, yeah, he talks this way, a lot of hyperbole, but at the end of the day, there's an institution that's going to rein him in. But we saw that was not the case. I mean, the most visible example was when they were separating children from their mothers forcibly at the border in an effort to terrorize those families and to deter others from even seeking to apply for asylum within the United States. And so it's very clear that this time we need to be prepared to confront more of the same and perhaps even worse. And so what are we doing? We're focused on, I would say there's two things that we're focused on. Primarily, we're focused on representing individuals and families, one case at a time, helping individuals who qualify for family visas, who qualify for self-petitions, who qualify for asylum or special immigrant juvenile visas, the ones who by law have a right to be here. We're helping them go through that process so they can get that stability and security. They have employment authorization or they have a green card, or people who have green cards, we're helping them apply for citizenship so they don't have that fear and that they know that they're going to be able to remain here with their family, in their home, in their school, whatever the case may be. So that's the first part. The second part is being ready to confront what is inevitably going to be a bunch of unlawful enforcement actions. Every administration has the right to issue guidelines, to decide what they're going to prioritize. And so, yes, the Trump administration will have the right to, implement new enforcement priorities, a new prioritization plan. But that has to be done within the confines of the constitutional safeguards, within the confines of the Immigration Nationality Act. And what we saw last time was that the Trump administration was willing to trample over all sorts of rights, both statutory and constitutional, in order to reach that larger goal of basically fulfilling that anti-immigrant agenda that they had promised.
One of the questions that comes to mind in this bigger picture discussion and what has been discussed during the campaign trail is the facilities in Washington State. Is there really even we know about the processing center down in Tacoma. Is there really an infrastructure to carry out or house people in a deportation process in Washington State as this president has threatened to do on the campaign trail?
Certainly not to accommodate the numbers that he has promised. So we have a detention center in Tacoma that houses just over 1,500 people. So 1,500 beds, people can be locked up there. Right now in the entire country, there's about close to 40,000 people on any given day who are locked up while they're going through these immigration proceedings. And it's important to remember, these are civil immigration proceedings. So when someone's locked up, it's not supposed to be a punishment. The only basis is to ensure that they're going to report to their hearing and that they can find out whether ultimately they're granted status to stay here or have to leave the country. And so no, there's not, and the detention center in Tacoma is, one of the 10 largest detention centers in the country. There's not capacity to all of a sudden, round up 1 million people and either keep them locked up or even to deport them. I mean, if you look at our immigration courts here in Washington State, the numbers have just increased dramatically over the course of the Biden administration. So at the beginning, you're talking about a backlog of probably 20,000 cases, and that's more than doubled to almost 50,000 cases. That's a backlog. We have clients who have been waiting years to have their opportunity to present their asylum claim or whatever the application is they're filing for in front of the immigration judge. And so what does it do to then throw another 1,000 people or 20,000 people in the mix? The system is further backlogged, and there's not a mechanism to be able to process all those cases in any sort of expedited fashion.
Well, you have heard what the former president and the new president-elect have said about the southern border in particular. There have been, in his words, immigrants that have been blamed for crimes and other issues. He talks a lot about fentanyl being a part of this and drug activity being a part of this. How do you respond to the president's claims about the southern border in particular, and that the country has allowed too many immigrants inside the United States?
Yeah, I mean, there's just no data to back up the president's claims. Look at who right now we have, like I said, just under 40,000 people locked up in immigration proceedings. And the Department of Homeland Security categorizes those individuals by threat level. And so, the highest threat level is 1, the second threat, level is medium threat. And then there's the group that constitute no threat that are locked up. And that's because they don't have a criminal record. And if you look at that, over 32,000 of less than 40,000 have no criminal record who are locked up. So the numbers don't back up any of the claims that the Trump administration is making. And in fact, like I said, it's during the Biden administration that the backlog in removal proceedings has dramatically increased because they placed more people in removal proceedings than any other administration. I mean, the numbers of people that were deported during the Biden administration by far outmeasure the numbers during the Trump administration. The Biden administration was quite harsh in its reaction to receiving individuals on the southern border, and implemented many restrictions that have prevented thousands of individuals from even applying for political asylum. So again, the numbers don't back up the president's claim. There's certainly immigrants who commit crimes, just like there's neighbors on my block who commit crimes. There are people like others. But what we know is that the vast majority of immigrants in this country don't have a criminal background and are embedded in the fabric of our communities. They're the ones who are, working in the hospitals, in tech industries. Our agricultural community would collapse without them. So that's the vast majority of the immigrant population.
Matt, I appreciate your time. I appreciate the feedback.
My pleasure.
According to federal data, Washington State was the 8th largest exporter of goods in 2023, with $11 billion of goods alone sent to China, more than any other country. And with talks again about a tariff war with that country, it could have a significant impact on small seafood producers like Jim Beret of tribal-owned Suquamish Seafoods. Jim, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris.
Well, I think, first of all, let's start with Suquamish Seafoods. You've got the sign over your shoulder. How long have you been in business? What have you been doing all these years in terms of the seafood business in Washington State?
So the Suquamish Seafoods came to existence back in the late 90s. 97, we jumped into the gooey duck business, harvesting. And that's what we ran off of for several years. And then our tribal government and council tasked us with expanding the operation. And we opened up this new facility here in 2015. And we started getting into crab, clams, finfish. And we buy the local product from our tribal members. It's given them a place and an opportunity to sell their harvest. And so it's really, we're doing a service to our tribal members and expanding the business. Back in 2020, we opened up a retail store. So now we have a retail outlet where we sell most of the seafood product that we purchase from tribal members. Basically straight off the boat onto the tables in the community, and most recently developing an online market as well for seafood.
But gooey duck is your main export, your main product.
Gooey duck is our main export. Over 98% of it goes directly to China. It'll, based on the order for today, say we have a 3,000 pound order today, we'll go out, we'll harvest it, bring it back, we package it, bring it to the airport, and it's off to the Chinese market same day it comes off the boat.
Any way to say what percentage of the business gooey duck has been in terms of exports to China since the 1990s?
So we have an annual quota every year. So this year, coming 2025, in our annual plan, we're looking at 225,000 pounds of quota. And that will, like I said, 98% of that will go directly to China after harvesting. I will say there's been a large decrease in our quota over the recent years due to sustainability, the recovery rate of the gooey duck itself. They're finding through research and science that they're not recovering as quickly as they had previously thought. They were looking at 12 to 15 year cycle in which you could harvest down a track and they would recover within that time, and then you can reopen it. Well, they're finding that it's more, towards 50 years in certain areas. So.
Well, I know a few years ago I was at the business, and you and I have talked about this, when the U.S. and China got into a tariff war of sorts. What happened back then in terms of your exports and the costs when those tariffs were going back and forth?
Yeah, so back then, 18 and 19, I believe we started feeling some effects of it, and the market wasn't what it was in the past. It really slowed down. Prices declined. The demand declined as well. So it took us a little longer to harvest our quota throughout those years. Some of it we weren't able to harvest due to the lack of demand and market, and you could carry that over in some cases to the following quota year, or you can lose that quota if you don't harvest it within that time. So navigating through the Chinese economy and those, the tariffs, made it real difficult. The price to pack out, materials and stuff, that gradually increased the cost of shipping. So there was a major effect in our ability to harvest as normal. And, sometimes the supply and demand in that case helped, in the sense that since the 90s, we've been dealing with some distributors, buyers / customers that we use. And, some of them are major players over there in China. So they were able to navigate some of that. And it actually, sometimes it helped with the price and the sales, just because the demand was where it was at. It could be not a large demand, but what was being ordered from us, it kind of helped a little bit. We managed to get through it. We did have a little bit of some tariff relief programs that helped offset some of the costs back in 2020. So I think it started.
And now we head into a second term from the former and soon-to-be President Donald Trump. He has talked on the campaign trail again about tariffs with China. When you hear that as a business owner who does a lot of trade with China, what crosses your mind?
Yeah, it for us in the seafood export industry, it can be a little terrifying to say the least. I think that it could be a little different possibly this time. I think that the Chinese economy is suffering a little more now than it was on the first trade war when that started. the Chinese economy hasn't, bounced back from COVID, the pandemic, for one thing. So the slow economy over there, the declining quotas, it all plays a role. And, with another trade war or tariffs being implemented, it could really affect us, and the bottom line here at Sequanimous Seafoods, can be hit fairly hard.
And we're just dealing with hypotheticals right now, a potential trade war where, there's a tit for tat tariff, 20% back and forth, where it makes it tougher for you to do business. I mean, is there a plan B? Is there something you can do domestically? Have you thought it through that far?
Yeah, of course, we look in and we reach out and are always trying to develop more of a domestic market over here. It's a little more difficult finding that market over here. It seems like, we don't want to pay the price that you can get by exporting it. And so there's not a real high demand. But yes, we're always trying to get it out there. All we can do is focus on our other species. We have 3 oyster fields that we're working on, still trying to get those back to pre-pandemic levels as far as sales and stuff. But as far as the gooey duck, there just isn't a large domestic market for that.
Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
Washington Congresswoman Susan Del Bene, a Democrat, along with 8 others, have introduced a bill called the Prevent Tariff Abuse Act, which they say will block any sort of blanket tariffs on imported goods without congressional approval. Homelessness continues to be a key issue in this state, and one that a lot of people are going to be watching with the new federal administration. Advocates arguing that federal spending on multiple programs could have a trickle-down effect here. Allison Eisinger is the executive director of the King County Coalition on Homelessness. I guess the first question is really a hypothetical. You know what the election results were. You care about homelessness in the state of Washington, in Western Washington, in Seattle. What do you think this new administration is going to mean for trying to solve some of the crises that we have seen now over the last several years?
Thanks for inviting me, Chris. I agree that what we are doing at this point is we are using informed speculation, but also we have information that the incoming second Trump administration has shared with the American people of what their plans and intentions are. And those plans include extreme proposals like dismantling the Department of Education and possibly the Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD, which is a terrifying prospect if you care about housing seniors, housing veterans, making sure that we have fewer people who are experiencing homelessness in our communities here in Western Washington, across our state, and across the whole country. I think what the first Trump administration did or attempted to do is a pretty good indication of where they consider their starting point to be when they do come into office in January of next year. And what they're proposing to do and what they did the first time around are the kinds of things that are going to increase the cost of living for the average American and make it even harder for people to afford the rent and pay their mortgages. So that's not good for anybody.
I think you told the Seattle Times that this is an issue you believe to be multi-layered when we talk about federal funding, federal resources coming to Washington State that do impact the broader issue of homelessness. You mentioned in particular concerns about Social Security, federal food benefits, public housing, and any changes to the ACA. How do those factor into the crises that we can see here in Western Washington?
Well, Chris, they factor into the crises we see, but they also factor into the solutions that we have in our community and that we actually need our federal government to continue to invest in so that we can continue to have good results for folks in Western Washington and across our state. So the Trump administration has given a number of of indications the first time around, and their plans, including Project 2025 and lots of interviews that are being given, indicate that they're interested in destroying the Affordable Care Act, taking healthcare coverage away from hundreds of millions of people, and undoing the Social Security plan, which provides benefits to elders, people with disabilities, folks in my family, folks in your family, and the other kinds of things that we know have worked to reduce poverty. Again, child poverty, senior poverty, poverty among working people who can't make ends meet, like food stamp benefits. Those are all up for massive cuts at the same time as the incoming Trump administration is proposing to give even more extraordinary billions of dollars in tax cuts to the wealthiest individuals, to billionaires. Those are things that are going to increase hardship and suffering, but they're also going to undermine the progress that we've made. Frankly, it's un-American to reduce and take us backwards where we have succeeded in doing things like helping formerly homeless veterans come home.
Why do you think this number has continued to go up, not only in Washington State, but across the country? 653,000 people across America are the estimate is homeless. This is an issue in Western Washington that's really spanned 3 different presidential administrations now, when you think about it, between the Biden administration, the Trump administration, and the Obama administration. That's when the state of emergency was declared in Seattle and King County. Why has this number grown across 3 different presidential administrations? They've all done different things in terms of funding and resources for this area, but the number has grown. Why?
Well, Chris, I think you first of all have to go back further than you have just suggested, sadly, because what we have here is a housing and homelessness crisis that goes back for multiple presidential administrations. Both Democrats and Republicans, by the way, have not succeeded in the level of investment in housing and, for those who need them, housing and supports that are necessary.
You've heard this in Washington State, and you've heard it on a national level as well, with that number going up. The idea that there needs to be more accountability for how this money is spent, with millions and millions of dollars going to this issue across the country, and the number going up, that perhaps somebody with a new set of eyes should be taking a look at this and demanding accountability. How do you answer that perhaps a fresh set of eyes may hold stakeholders more accountable in all of this?
Well, first of all, I think we should be clear. We're not going to get a fresh set of eyes. We're going to get people who are Trump loyalists, who will say whatever they think their boss wants and needs to hear, not what is true and what is useful to the American people. That's, of course, a tremendous threat to the good functioning of government at the federal level. What I would say is, when I talk about accountability, when people think about what it means to be accountable, it has to involve clear information, transparency, and not pretending that the kinds of tiny little investments that have in fact been what we have made in what is a large area, making sure that people have homes and the supports they need, that we cannot pretend that those modest investments are adequate.
And we both know in Western Washington, people have been aware of for at least a decade, if not longer, to your point. But in the last few years, it does seem like fentanyl has really kind of changed the conversation when it comes to homelessness. It does seem like there are Democrats and Republicans who are aware of the needs and the mental health needs for some members of the homeless population. Do you think there is some common ground here to get more federal support for behavioral health, for the social needs as it relates to fentanyl that is a factor in what we see here locally?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. As I said before, I don't believe that housing and homelessness are fundamentally partisan issues. I really believe that the American people see the value in helping people meet their basic needs, and that includes having a safe place to live. Not a fancy place, but a safe and consistent place to live. The substance use disorder spending absolutely is at risk under a Trump administration, and I think it's a really interesting question to see whether or not we can find, as you suggest, common ground, not only to increase investments in treatment and recovery, long-term recovery, but to understand the ways in which having a stable place to live is essential for people to be able to find that road to recovery. No one gets better on the street.
Allison, I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris.
As you heard from our guests, there's a lot of speculation and hypotheticals about what will happen once the former and soon-to-be again President Donald Trump is sworn in. KOMO News will be diving into all of these issues. We'll continue to be asking the hard questions of the local, state, and national leaders. But for now, thanks for watching. I'm Chris Daniels. I'll see you soon on KOMO News.